and I work at WOLA. My work has really focused in security and in border security mostly, but I'm not an expert in migration, so I will yield the floor to the experts. But prior to this, we can listen to everything in Spanish, everything in English. It depends on your language of preference, and you can do so by clicking on the button that says floor. Floor. So in order for us to introduce today's panel, well, this is the last of 4 panels that we have been holding in the last couple of weeks regarding how the Donald Trump times or the Trump administration has affected the security and human rights in the hemisphere, and how this has affected any civil spaces and their closing. But let's look at some figures. In Venezuela, it says that 4.5 million Venezuelans have left their country, and 1 of every 7 Venezuelans have fled. Many are throughout South America. And the border between the United States and Mexico, since 2014, the U.S. authorities have detained 3,700,000 Cuban immigrants, and many of them have been minors. And since the end of the wet foot, dry foot policy, they have also detained several Cubans, and this began from the repressions. We have Haitians also coming to Mexico and the Dominican Republic. We have thousands of African and Asian migrants that are going through the Darien Gap, which is of great peril. And also there's internally displaced persons, as we know. And of course, this while the pandemic president in the history of the United States, our government is building walls, cutting the amount of refugees, and sending asylum seekers back to Mexico or their place of origin. And this is what's happening. And migration has been used. And we have seen this through Breitbart and Fox and everything that's happening. This will continue to happen and affecting a very important sector of our population. But what does the dynamic look like in the rest of the hemisphere? How have the governments and civil society in Latin America have had to adjust their responses to migration due to Trump's approach? And how have they responded to the total harassment from the White House? Is there any leader in the region that can stand up to Trump and his xenophobic anti-migrant efforts? Here we have to discuss this Gretchen Kuhner, director from the Institute for Women and Migration, IMUMI in Mexico. IMUMI works so that migrant women in Mexico can have the right to develop their lives, either their working lives, emotional well-being, social development. And also we have the honor of welcoming Ursula Roldan, director of the Research Institute on Global and Territorial Dynamics from the Rafael Landivar University of the Research Institute on Global and Territorial Dynamics from the Rafael Landivar University in Guatemala. She studies the tensions among the globalized processes and development, and also the border dynamic for human mobility. And once he's able to connect, we'll have Marco Romero. He's the Director for Human Rights and Displacement CODES and professor at the National University of Colombia. He's in Bogota. And he specializes in human mobility and has done so for several years. And he, for many years, was also in terms of human rights. Now he has been able to allow for his office to grow under his leadership. Now, the first question I have for our panelists, and this is in general, as a result of the pandemic, almost all states have closed their borders, and there are more limits to people's ability to move. On its part, the government of Trump has responded by expelling, without even being processed, some migrants from Mexico and Central America, including thousands of unaccompanied minors, as flights continue deporting them, even as some of them are COVID positive deportees. What is the dynamic current status for deportees, including the expelled migrants in transit or refugees and asylum seekers, including the expelled migrants in transit or refugees and asylum seekers in the countries where you work? Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to participate, WOLA. Thank you for the opportunity to reflect on this current situation in terms of migration in Mexico. As many of you know, Mexico currently has people that are stranded between borders. They are asylum seekers that them in Mexico. So let's talk about these dynamics. In the northern border, we have around 20,000 people who are right now in the MPP program to keep them in Mexico with some asylum requests. In the United States, however, as a result of the pandemic, the hearings have been suspended. So this is a population which is in a limbo. They're in Tijuana, Mexicali, Nogales, Nuevo Laredo, Ciudad Juárez. Well, Ciudad Juárez has the biggest population, then Reynosa and Matamoros. And of those 20,000 people, 60% are women and minors. So it's important to keep in mind that the dynamic in this region is changing and has changed. So we have the MPP population, and as of March 20th, with the pandemic, the Trump administration began to expel people who could have been part of the MPP program. And so then the Mexican people are expelled immediately. And well, Mexico has agreed to receive 100 people from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras per day. We know that there's more and other nationalities are being embraced, but here they've expelled about 300,000 people since March 20th. So for Central Americans, well, either they are captured and deported from Mexico to Central America, or they're in an absolute limbo. 100,000 people since March 20th. So for Central Americans, well, either they are captured and deported from Mexico to Central America, or they're in an absolute limbo because they're not going through any process in Mexico or the United States. Moreover, we have Mexican deportees because the U.S. has exported 88,000 people, Mexican people, in 2020. And as Adam was saying, many of them are coming from U.S. detention centers. And so many of them either are asymptomatic COVID carriers or they are COVID positive. And so this would further spread. COVID. And then we also have asylum seekers. We have about 20,000 in the first 7 months of 2020. This is lower than last year. That notwithstanding, we still have many coming in to Tapachulas, Chiapas in the south of the country. And then just as with the hearings in the U.S. being suspended, the Comarque, which is their counterpart, they have also suspended their hearings. So again, these people are in limbo, and 75,000 people that were awaiting asylum resolutions, well, they're now in limbo as well. Now we see that the flow has lowered between March to May, but then in June and July, we see that it's having another uptick. And it's worth, I'd leave it there regarding the population and the difficulties they're undergoing, as they are also at a standstill. Thank you, Gretchen. Before I give the floor to Ursula, just to remind you that if you need interpretation, you can listen to the different languages by hitting the button. And if you want to send a question, you can do so by using the Twitter hashtag WOLA taking stock. I understand that Marco is online, but we can't see him. Well, I hope we can see you soon in Guatemala and Central America. I think you can hear me now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, WOLA, for the invitation. Well, what's the situation for Guatemala vis-a-vis migrants? Well, we are those who send many migrants when we see that our people have been stranded in Mexico and the United States. Many of them are asylum seekers. Also, there was another phenomenon, which was the so-called reverse migration. So in the moment that the borders are closed, all those that are in transit, they themselves decide to go back to Guatemala. And this, plus the deportations from the U.S. During the time of the pandemic, and the fact that some of these flights had COVID positive passengers. Well, right now we have about 200 people who apparently were coming in with COVID. I'm sorry, we lost sound. Ursula, are you in mute? We can't hear you. Unfortunately, we lost your signal about a minute ago. We were talking about the deportations that were coming in COVID positive. Yes, as I was saying, when COVID positive people are being deported, well, they are being rejected by the countries. And so the governments have undertaken measures to set up shelters that would receive these migrants. Then also flights were suspended. There were no deportations due to these claims from Guatemala telling the U.S. that they were not claims from Guatemala telling the U.S. that they were not fulfilling the protocols, and now the deportations are reactivated. Something else that's worth mentioning is that since the pandemic began, the ACA agreement was suspended. That was negotiated from November to March. And more than 900 asylum and refugee requests have already been processed or were filed by Hondurans and Salvadorans, and only some had requested to stay and receive asylum in Guatemala. This, for us, well, the suspension of ACA is something good because we actually never agreed with it. We know that the negotiation was an anomaly, and it was not done all the legal proceedings in Guatemala. But the pandemic made it so that this would be suspended, and this actually gave us a respite because we hope that all the legal proceedings that were normal in the U.S. continue, and that in lieu of ACA. Something else that's important, and I'll wrap up with that, is that in spite of all the perils that the migrants are going through, both those who have been returning and those who are stranded between borders, well, those that got to the U.S. and were infected, some died as a result of it, and some of them couldn't find jobs so quickly. But in spite of all of this, the remittance U.S. and were infected, some died as a result of it, and some of them couldn't find jobs so quickly. But in spite of all of this, the remittances being sent have surpassed previous years. And this somehow shows the commitments that the migrants still have before their families and their communities, and the enormous strides that they're making in order to keep on making a living even under those conditions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ursula. Now, Marco, we don't have many deportees from the U.S. in Colombia. It's a different dynamic. But as an introduction, how would you describe the refugee dynamic of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia? Well, first, invitation to discuss this. Well, Colombia is undergoing a multidimensional crisis in terms of forced migrant mobility because people are looking to find some prosperity, but we're receiving a mass flow from Venezuela and other countries. So we have 8 million displaced persons and new phenomena because more than 30,000 displaced persons in this year only. Also, we have people who have returned, but some that are still fleeing, trying to find international protection. Now, this is the general situation. Now, in terms of Venezuelans, what's happened is that we have about 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia, and the Colombian government has responded in terms of giving them a permit to remain there and to provide responses are short-term responses These are emergency measures that cannot really endure. And what we have seen in the context of the pandemic is that what's happening with Venezuela, plus the enormous contingents that are now living in extreme poverty and in the informal economy, they are even greater exposed to the pandemic. And that's why we are the number 8 country in terms of the most COVID cases. And we see how Venezuelans would rather go back to their precarious situation in Venezuela than to stay in Colombia, because they would have to pay rent to stay in these harsh conditions. And so we also have indigenous peoples. And so we also have indigenous peoples who are having to pay a daily fee in order to be in these precarious situations. So this has exacerbated our social crisis in Colombia because we have not taken a firm stance against it. And the pandemic has been also faced with some subsidies from the government, but there's no means for them to provide a daily living for everyone, but they will continue to live in a very precarious situation, economically speaking. So we see caravans of people trying to get back to Venezuela, and they're trapped because they can't leave Colombia due to the confinement measures, and they don't see a way out. And so in the city halls of the large cities, they're trying to help. And even the federal government is trying to help, but it's not enough. They've never been prepared for a crisis such as this, not in a long-term manner at least, and not just in an emergency with the basics. Thank you, Marco. Yes, these short-term responses is something that we have seen over and over again in the region. Now, Gretchen, Mexico has borne the brunt of what the U.S. policy has been now. Manuel Lopez Obrador was doing a lot in terms of their humanitarian approach towards migrants, but Trump has waged some threats, and now they almost seem like a partner to close the access to the United States border. Why do you think that Mexico or the Mexican government has responded so willingly to the demands of the United States? Well, that is the million-dollar question. Why is it that in Mexico, under the administration of Manuel Lopez Obrador, they started with a rhetoric that was pro-Central America, calling them brothers and sisters in this development, and suddenly the change, this shift in their stance? I believe that there are many reasons for it. Well, nobody from Foreign Affairs has told me this is the reason, but I believe Foreign Affairs has told me this is the reason, but I believe that they assessed the situation, and what they really wanted was for Donald Trump to lay off Mexico, because Lopez Obrador's project and this fourth transformation project is a national project after all. And it is meant to fight corruption, reduce inequality for Mexico. President Lopez Obrador is not interested in diplomacy and foreign relations. He wants to fully concentrate in his national agenda. And so I think they just realized that they wanted to do what was needed for him to stop going after Mexico, because At the beginning, Mexico wanted to ensure the signing of the USMCA. Now that was achieved, but then I don't know if they have been talking about protecting Mexicans in the United States. Mexico always is in that situation where they want to negotiate protection for the 5 million undocumented Mexicans in the United States, or the 600,000 dreamers who are Mexican, thinking maybe they could win some points for DACA, or maybe to find cooperation in other matters. At the beginning, the United States was hinting at them willing to invest in development in Mexico and with Central America, but that has not really come to fruition. And then the Chancellery has made some attempts to address other matters, for example, terrorism, racism against the Mexican population in the United States, to reduce arms trafficking from the U.S. to Mexico, then cooperation to fight drug trafficking. So we are not really sure about where the quid pro quo is. At least I don't see something clearly there. What is clear to me is that it could be done because, politically speaking, migration in Mexico doesn't have a lot of weight, really. The Mexican government can also violate human rights of migrants. They allow for homicides, kidnappings, even massacres, with very little political cost for them. And it's terrible what I'm saying, but all this doesn't carry a lot of political cost for them. So they can measure these type of measures and this kind of cooperation and know that that doesn't mean they will get more support from their base in Mexico, which is the López Obrador base. And regarding the implications of these measures when cooperating with MPP and to receive Central Americans, as well as expelling people based on what the CDC says, well, it's been devastating for asylum seekers, for the migrants. It has been horrendous. There's been extortion, theft, death, rapes. I think that many reports have come from Human Rights Watch, from Doctors Without Borders. Something else that's happened is that the asylum requests have increased in Mexico, which is not something bad, but we know that Central Americans, but also Haitians, they have family members in the U.S. Their support networks are in the U.S., not here. And I believe that there's been also a cost for traffickers and the trafficking modalities. We are representing some of their cases in Tamaulipas, and we've heard the horrible situation they've undergone in terms of sexual violence and the lack of food. And this plight is clear, and it's because of the lack of measures between the U.S. and Mexico, and implications are terrible. Very true. Thank you, Gretchen. That's all very compelling. Now, Ursula, you already mentioned ACA and the Honduran migrants and Salvadoran migrants that have returned to Guatemala. Why is it that the government of Jimmy Morales and now Alejandro Chamate have happening? Well, how has put or did Guatemala seek limits on deportations from the United States, and what are other actions undertaken by the government? Well, unfortunately, the Jimmy Morales government established a strategy to have an impact around those near Trump so that they could cover up the corruption and impunity taking place in Guatemala back then and now, which was undercovered by the CC from 2015. So this meant that the Jimmy Morales government and his Minister of Interior and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, well, they had a policy that was complacent to Donald Trump's policies. Well, they had a policy that was complacent to Donald Trump's policies. And that's on one side, but then also, of course, the U.S.'s and President Trump's pressure put on Mexico's government on what Gretchen just mentioned, and for Central America to also control their migrant population that was fleeing to the U.S. looking for asylum due to the insecurity and socioeconomic circumstances that make it impossible for these Central Americans to stay in their countries. So these two conditions, well, on one hand, the Jimmy Morales administration, which sought to support the U.S. administration, which had maintained in the past this fight against corruption and fight against impunity. Well, that was in the previous administration, but with the Trump administration, that shifted drastically. And it allowed for impunity and corruption to remain in Central America, while the U.S. then halted Central American migration. Now, the current President Alejandro Yamatei, at the beginning of his term, he said that he would analyze the ACA agreement and that he would establish the conditions under which it was signed, and he would probably repeal it. This is what he said at the beginning, but then months later, this was also dismissed. And he said that it would be complied with. Now, that was in February. Then in March, the pandemic hits. And that's when the ACA agreement was suspended. And that's where we're at now. And we understand that right now we've received some encouraging news from the U.S. where this policy to seek justice and fight corruption and impunity might be furthered. And so then we would hope that the ACA agreement is not one of the chief policies they take on, but that if Central Americans are seeking asylum, that they are then supported with these measures. Guatemala, due to the reduction in pressure to fight corruption, that's where you see the quid pro quo. Well, Marco, you already addressed this matter regarding the Colombian short-term response, but instead, well, in spite of this, Colombia has been commended for receiving as many Venezuelan migrants as they have and all the services rendered. But suddenly this reaction is due to the fact that Colombia sent so many refugees to Venezuela during its armed conflict not so long ago. In your view, Marco, have they deserved these compliments? And in the meantime, how has the Trump administration responded to the immigration crisis and support a humanitarian response in a regional and coordinated manner? Well, let me address both quickly. First, Colombia has one of the most precarious migrant systems in the world. They only help former presidents like Carmona from Venezuela or Alan Garcia. They have great systems to tend to these people when they seek asylum. But their services for Venezuelan migrants that are forcefully sent here, well, the Cartagena Agreement asks that we recognize them as refugees, but Colombia has abandoned this. We don't have the strong institutions to do this. We don't have a way to tackle this. So they have just treated them all as migrants. And you know that just treated them all as migrants. And you know that the difference between migrants and refugees is a marked difference. Their protection status as migrants is far weaker. And also the type of assistance and the term in which they can provide this assistance for, well, it's different. It's short term, and they need to renew their residence periods over and over again. And these are just short term and partial services. And well, that being said, yes, we can recognize that not deporting them as their knee-jerk reaction is good, but the thing is that also the migration happened almost in a de facto manner. It was before they knew they had all these migrants here, as they had permeated the borders. So this was something that they resolved on the go. And they were only looking at the short term with precarious measures in place. And that is why all this has been laid to bear. And people are seeing what the Colombian needs are as well, because we have about 90,000 people going back to Venezuela in spite of what they have to face there. And also, it's important to highlight this ensuing tension that the ILO, the WHO, the World Food Organization, they have all said that is happening. We will lose a decade of development in the region. The IMF says that more than 10 points of our GDP, well, extreme poverty reaching 83 million people, and we have 40 million people that will need to be tended to by these organizations. So this might lead to greater migration because people flee economic crisis, social crisis, and wars. And now we find a place where the social crisis has been exacerbated in the most unequal region of the world. And now people are going to look for other alternatives. So it's important to see how the world trend right now is protectionism, and for each country to go at it their own way and to save themselves. But we also see it in Europe, where countries are closing borders. And Ivan Terres, in developing countries or poorer countries. So it's disproportionate in terms of who assumes the cost of refugees in their territories. So we need to look for a global solution. And as Alnorno Terres said, we can't go at it alone. And ECLAC also has political leaders and human rights leaders, and we hope that they spearhead a regional response that's focused in the most vulnerable populations. And we know that the most vulnerable are the forced migrants, the refugees, also indigenous and African descendants. And we hope that the UN and the US can help with the UN and some other European countries that are part of ECLAC, so that we can have an intra-regional approach that can help the poorer part of ECLAC, so that we can have an intra-regional approach that can help the poorer countries have other alternatives. Of course, ECLAC has mentioned progressive tax reforms because this would lead to better income distribution and for us to help overcome the pandemic. The U.S. has a very restrictive policy in place vis-a-vis migrants, and we know this. In the case of Colombia and Venezuela, what we see is that the U.S., well, it's been talking about UNHCR and IOM, and we know that the U.S. is supporting these agencies with funding as well. But we know that the demands from the migrants and the demand for resources far surpass what these organizations can give. From the migrants and the demand for resources far surpass what these organizations can give them. Thank you very much, Marco. And you almost answered my last question. I think we have about 13 minutes, so I think we will try and deepen these topics with our conclusion. And this is regarding the future because we have seen an increase in human mobility, but this could also foreshadow other things that could come, which includes more migration. Now, if we continue with a Trump government, there's almost no possibility that there will be any efforts made to support migrants. They will keep on trying to limit the amount of asylum seekers coming in. Now, if there is a change in government here, well, there might be some other suggestions that will be taken into account. But not only the U.S., but for international organizations, namely ECLAC, well, what are the steps they should take in the face of hostile governments, or if that changes here, what are the steps that should be undertaken? And then for Gretchen, the same question. Well, if the protection system in our country, because we have a very broad and generous law to protect migrants. But the problem is that the budget is of only $2 million per year that is assigned to the commission. It's been doubled from last year. And just last year, they had 70,000 requests. So obviously, there's very little political will to strengthen the protection system for asylum seekers here in Mexico. And this is something that we are, of course, trying to incentivize. And regarding, Mexico's process to recognize asylum seekers. Well, we do so under the Cartagena Agreement, and it's also under the refugee law in Mexico, and also they include the Venezuelan population. They've also included the Cartagena guidelines for Hondurans to invoke, and I think that there's been discussions to include Salvadorans in that as well. So how can you have a country that recognizes firsthand that these migrants are fleeing their countries due to generalized violence and different atrocities? And then you have the U.S., which acts as if Hondurans and Salvadorans and Venezuelans are criminals. So there you see that Hondurans and Venezuelans are criminals. So there you see that dichotomy and that politicization of asylum. And in Mexico, we need to keep pushing so that there's a greater recognition and better protections. But also, we need to restructure the way that they can access work visas, Central Americans and other nationalities. But right now, Venezuelans and Nicaraguans, for example, are the ones that have the best cases for asylum under the Title 51. And so, well, with or without Trump, that's what Mexico needs to keep doing. Now, I don't know if I'm over my time, but I think the Lopez Obrador rhetoric at the beginning, not the actions, but the rhetoric at the beginning was good. We might need to change the narrative of Mexico towards Central America and work more as a region. Of course, the Central America and Mexico Development Agreement enjoyed the support of ECLAC. However, this was fledgling and it started to make inroads, but it was very symbolic. And their rhetoric needs to change the narrative. And that's important. And then when it comes to, I have so much to say. I was looking at my notes. If Biden wins, for example, we know that he had this situation with Alliance for Prosperity, and we know what happened with minors as they were coming in back then, and that was not great. But here, if Biden wins, he will have an enormous undertaking before him because he will have to build up what Donald Trump has dismantled. And it will need to be done gradually, maybe starting with the MPP or Title 42. So when granting them asylum and working with these measures, starting with Title 42, of course, the inadmissibility, the metering, stop practicing MPP, and Ursula talked about ACA. Well, it's absurd, I think, that they can just be canceled. There are things that can be done, but also I think that, as Marcos said, Biden would have to really prepare himself for a new post-COVID exodus. And this is an enormous challenge because he needs to find a way to rebuild this and then look at the border issues between the U.S. and Mexico. Thank you very much, Gretchen. It is a shame. I don't like to have to summarize everything and put it into just 1 hour, but we have just a few minutes to hear your responses on the same question. Well, just to say that Central America is undergoing a very critical situation in terms of exclusion. And in Guatemala, this was more evident because there they started to attack the root causes that tackled the drug trafficking ties between the government and the drug traffickers and the impunity around this. And this was keeping us from having the right social and economics and the impunity around this. And this was keeping us from having the right social and economic means, and so that we could really tackle the historic systemic underpinnings that have been affecting us for decades. And this would only be exacerbated with the pandemic. So if there's a lack of governance, the only ones that win are drug traffickers and organized crime. And we won't be able to work with institutions that are not viable and that cannot guarantee rule of law. So the United States needs to be very clear on these circumstances because, as Gretchen said, whether Biden or Trump wins, we need a stand also with respect to the policies that strengthen justice. And then Central America also has a fundamental challenge to establish domestic policies for regional mobility, and they need to strengthen the CA4. This is what allows for them to move throughout Central America and to broaden this CA4 system that is not going to only allow them to move temporarily, but also for labor goals and for social mobility. And now we include Mexico as well, not just Central America, because our ties with Mexico are stronger than ever since our people are now staying in Mexico. We need to reestablish our dialogue, our cross-border relations, and bring about development and work towards development, not only security, and development and work towards development, not only security, and strengthen the socioeconomic underpinnings as well, so that we can have a more prosperous region. And with the United States, obviously, what we need to build is this discussion on migration. We need to open that discussion because with President Obama, some agreements were signed, but even with that, some deportations took place. But the difference from that to President Trump's system is that anything that we had made inroads in with President Obama was dismantled. We still have youths who get to the US as children and now are youths and waiting for them to be processed. We have TPS, we have asylum seekers being revoked, and we need to bring families together because this is really breaking families apart. The fact that children are left in the US with other family members, with members of the church or NGOs, and understanding the precarious situation in these detention centers. Well, they need to rethink the migration system deeply. Unless we start to look at greater numbers in trafficking in persons, which we have already evidenced, and that's seriously affecting our children and their rights and women and their rights. So these are all the challenges we have before us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Marco, I'm sorry to leave you for last. Well, thank you very much. And I think Gretchen and Ursula have touched on some really key areas. But I just want to highlight a couple of things. One, the pandemic brought a terrible disaster, but also an opportunity for us to reckon and to rethink how we're doing things. It's conveying a message because those societies that don't have social protection networks are divested of these social measures that were needed. And also the governments and the incoming governments will find that the pandemic has changed the rule of the game, and they need to that were needed. And also the governments and the incoming governments we'll find that the pandemic has changed the rule of the game, and they need to reformulate plans based on what we see now. And in the US, it's clear that we have two currents. First, isolationism, just as President Trump wants, and then others that want to strengthen multilateral organizations, namely the WHO and UN. And the UN Secretary General once made an important calling. Well, he made a call to action vis-a-vis human rights after the World War. And this should be the moment where another calling is made, urging us to have more sound integration instruments, because we have been erratic in terms of integration. We've had different degrees of success in these different mechanisms, but nothing that can encompass it all successfully. So we need to look at Europe in order to find better alternatives in that sense. And then lastly, I think that the US can look that the Security Council asked for a ceasefire in Colombia and the Andean region, and I think that that policy should be maintained to discourage wars, because also these political disasters lead to wars, and these lead to hunger and persecution, among others. So we need to go back to multilateralism, to integration. This is a moment of solidarity and humanity, I would say. It's not save yourselves. Thank you so much, Marcos. And thank you to our panelists and audience. Well, yes, I hear you in terms of an upcoming exodus, and also corruption, organized crime, and how the U.S. Has decided to keep on harassing other partners, and then also short-term approaches by the countries, and how we need to resist the US's unilateral impositions, have the countries apply or enforce their own laws with more institutionality, having more multilateral approaches, and a worldwide ceasefire would be wonderful. And changing the narrative is important, and that the US will have to rebuild what has been deconstructed in the last few years. Now, I want to thank Maureen Meyer for being here. She is also from WOLA and here to help us wrap up this series. Thank you very much, Adam. As Adam was saying, I just want to give you my closing remarks, and for that, I will shift to English.
Switching. So, as Adam mentioned, I mean, this series really aimed to examine the impact of the Trump administration's policies on human rights and democracy in Latin America, and imagine what would be needed to change course in US foreign policy. The panels touched on key issues in the region, from the consolidation of power by authoritarian leaders, rising corruptions and attempts to undermine the rule of law, threatening democratic norms and closing civic space, and then to today's panel on migration, human mobility, the situation of asylum seekers and refugees. I think in all the panels, it was clear that many of these troubling trends exist prior to the Trump administration. From the factors that gave rise to the support for authoritarian leaders and weakening trust in democratic processes, to widespread government corruption and resistance to having long-term solutions for asylum seekers and refugees. But that all of these issues have been exacerbated as a result of the Trump presidency and his administration, either by leaders who emulate some of the worst tendencies of Trump himself, or through the failure to support human rights and democracy as key tenets of US foreign policy. I think we've also seen recent events in the United States regarding police abuse, racial injustice, the deployment of federal agents to local communities when local governments haven't asked for them to be there, to efforts to foment doubt in the US election process, make clear there's still a lot of work to do domestically to promote human rights and democracy in the United States. In regard to Latin America, panelists in all four panels pinpointed ways in which the Trump administration has legitimized policies and actions that are detrimental to human rights and freedom of expression, that have undermined promising efforts to combat corruption, ideologized support for political leaders while overlooking their actions that threaten democracy, failed to really foster and promote regional efforts to address the humanitarian crisis, particularly of the Venezuelans in South America, and adopted, as Gretchen mentioned today, and Ursula, draconian policies in response to migrants and asylum seekers in need of protection. And I think it's been important that apart from assessing the impact of the Trump administration in the regime, several panelists raised important roles that the U.S. Congress has as a counterbalance to the Trump administration, and how through letters, statements, even conditions on U.S. assistance, you can have an impact and produce change. Other panelists touched on the role that USAID has played in cooperating on justice reform issues or support for journalists and human rights defenders under threat, and the role the Department of Justice has played in investigating and prosecuting cases of corruption. Lastly, though, and I think it's important kind of end, is the panels really sought to promote discussions on how the US could have a more constructive role in the region. For example, through working multilaterally to address threats to democracy and human rights, promoting free and fair elections that are divorced from political ideology, supporting people leading efforts to combat corruption, courageous judges, prosecutors, and investigative journalists who continue to come under attack. And as we heard today, to fomenting regional cooperation and responses to address the large flow of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, while upholding, which we have not seen in this administration, the United States' own national and international obligations to protect people in need. So there are a lot of other concrete proposals put forward that will be important to discuss as we continue to advocate for human rights, social justice, and democracy in Latin America, and develop proposals for priority issues moving forward, either facing 4 more years of Trump administration or a transition government in the United States. I want to thank everyone for participating today, and in all the other panels. Thank the interpreters, especially thank Kara Hernandez from WOLA for her support in pulling the entire series together, and certainly invite you to check out WOLA's webpage for all the videos of the panels, and we're going to be producing some of the materials to accompany it. So thank you all again, and we're happy to have the end of this series with such an important discussion as the one we had today.